do poltergeists come from? Are they trapped spirits doomed to roam the earth, wreaking havoc on the unsuspecting? Or are they the manifestations of our own fears and traumas? If we bottle up our own pain, can it burst forth from us in the most hauntiest of ways? Welcome to Strange and Unexplained with me, Daisy Egan. I am a big proponent of ridding oneself of trauma. I believe in therapy and its power to heal one's psyche. And I believe if you make the mistake of pushing your trauma down, that shit is just going to come back to haunt you. And maybe everyone else around you. Esther Cox was born prematurely in March of 1860 in Nova Scotia. Her mother died within weeks of her birth. There's not a lot of information about the circumstances of the premature birth or her mother's subsequent death, but it's safe to assume that there were complications in the pregnancy and/or labor. Women don't usually die so soon after childbirth without it being related somehow. Her father remarried when Esther was about 6, and by the time she was 11, records show she and her older sisters Jane and Ellen were no longer living with their father and his wife. It's hard to imagine this was a happy situation for Esther and her sisters, as her father's 2 new children and a son from his wife's first marriage were all living with the parents. Why the 3 elder daughters were sent away, I don't know. It seems that the girls lived with their grandmother. Much of her story comes from the telling of one man, an actor named Walter Hubble, who wrote the book from which basically all the information for this story came. According to Hubble, quote, Esther has always been a queer girl. When born, she was so small that her good, kind grandmother who raised her mother having died when she was 3 weeks old, had to wash and dress her on a pillow, and in fact keep her on it all the time until she was 9 months old, at which age her weight was only 5 pounds. When she was quite a little girl, her father, Archibald T. Cox, married again and moved to Maine, where he has since resided. Having followed his second wife to the grave, he married a third with whom he is now living. Esther's early years having been spent with her grandmother, she very naturally became grave and old-fashioned, without knowing how or why. Like all little girls, she was remarkably susceptible to surrounding influences, and the sedate manner and actions of the old lady made an early impression on Esther that will cling to her through life." End quote. Okay, so first of all, according to census data, Archibald never lived in Maine. Also, he only married twice. And one could write these errors off as no big deal, but I think it helps highlight the fact that we really only have one source for this story, and already his facts seem a little fuzzy. Also, not for nothing, but how does one follow his second wife to the grave and then marry a third wife? Doesn't following someone to a grave mean they died shortly after the first one died? Also, he died before his second wife, so he didn't follow her to any grave. And you know I can't move on without highlighting, she very naturally became grave and old-fashioned. LOL. And how he knew she was remarkably susceptible is beyond me, except that he seems to think it's an immutable fact that that's how all little girls are. Also, Esther had always been a queer girl. Brother, same. By the time she was 19, Esther was living in a very small 4-bedroom cottage in the town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, with both her older sisters, Olive and Jane. Olive's husband, Daniel, their sons, Willie and George, Daniel's brother, John, and Esther's stepbrother, John, who, as far as I can work out, must have been their father's second wife's son from her previous marriage? How on earth he came to live with them, I don't know. This seems like a super random bunch of folks all crammed together in one house. And if you lost count, that's 8 people sharing 4 bedrooms. In a book titled Personal Experiences in Spiritualism from the early 1900s, Psychical researcher Hereward Carrington described the cottage as being so small as to be, quote, incapable of concealing anyone for long without discovery, end quote. It's worth noting that Carrington's main source for the chapter on Amherst is indeed Hubble. And though he said he went to the town to interview witnesses, he admits that most of them were dead by then. Anyway, it was a tiny house with a lot of people in it. The house was also kept spotless. So Esther was 19 in August of 1878 when she went on a carriage ride with a man named Bob McNeil, whom she was dating, or whatever the equivalent of dating was in 1878. According to Hubble, quote, while driving through a small wood, Bob seemed to be suddenly seized with an attack of what lawyers are pleased to term emotional insanity, for he dropped the reins and leaped from the buggy. Upon reaching the ground, he drew from the side pocket of his coat a large revolver and, pointing it at Esther, told her in a loud voice to get out of the buggy or he would kill her where she sat. She, of course, refused to do as he requested, or rather commanded, and as it was raining and becoming quite dark, she told him to get into the buggy and drive her home and not act like a crazy man. The remark about acting like a crazy man seemed to enrage him past endurance, for he uttered several terrible oaths and, aiming the revolver at her heart, was about to fire when the sound of wheels were heard rumbling in the distance. He immediately jumped into the buggy, seized the reins, and drove at a breakneck pace through the pouring rain to Dan's cottage. Esther was wet through by the time they had arrived at the gate. She jumped out, opened the gate, entered the cottage, and ran upstairs without noticing Jane, whom she passed in the hall. Bob, as soon as she got out, drove rapidly down the street. End quote. Esther spent the next week pretty despondent. In fact, one might say she had PTSD. Quote, for the next 4 days, Esther seemed to be suffering from some secret sorrow. She could not remain in the house, but was continually on the street or at some of the neighbors' houses, and every night she cried herself to sleep. End quote. On the night of September 4th, Esther woke her sister Jane, asking her if it was the 4th, and Jane was basically like, fuck off, I'm sleeping, yes, it's the 4th, so what? According to Hubble, Esther replied, quote, oh, nothing. It is just a week tonight since I went riding with Bob. Oh, what will become of me? And she instantly burst into another crying spell. End quote. To this, Jane replied, quote, Esther, do you know I think you are losing your mind, and that if you keep on this way, you will get so crazy that we will have to put you in the insane asylum? End quote. Cool empathy, bro. Although, to be fair, apparently Esther had not told anyone what had actually happened on the date with Bob. She just came home incredibly distressed, and no one knew why. It also bears mentioning here that her family didn't like Bob and had been warning her to stay away from him. The threat of the insane asylum apparently had the desired effect, and Esther immediately stopped crying. 10 or 15 minutes later, Esther screamed and jumped out of bed, saying she thought there was a mouse in her bed. Upon searching for said mouse, apparently Jane eventually was like, oh, no worries, the mouse is inside the mattress. See how it's kind of moving around in there? I don't think it can get out. No big deal. Excuse me, what? The mouse was in her mattress? No thank you. Not today, Bob the mouse, or Bob the asshole with the gun. The next night, though, the mouse was back at it, and Esther wasn't having it. This time, they determined the sound was coming from inside a box under the bed. Hubble wrote, quote, they placed the box out in the middle of the room and were much amazed to see the box jump up in the air about a foot and then fall over on its side. The girls could not believe their own eyes, so Jane placed the box in its old position in the middle of the room, and both watched it intently, when to their amazement, the same thing occurred again. The girls were now really frightened and screamed as loudly as they could for Dan, who put on some clothing and came into their room to ascertain what was the matter. They told him what had just taken place, but he only laughed, and after pushing the box under the bed and remarking that they must be insane or perhaps had been dreaming, he went back to bed grumbling because his rest had been disturbed. End quote. So, no one bothered to open the box? That seems like the most logical first step. And just in case you're keeping score, this is the second time Esther has been told she's insane for having feelings about something objectively upsetting. Strangers, this episode is brought to you by IQBAR, our exclusive snack sponsor. IQBAR is the better-for-you, plant protein-based snacks made with brain-boosting nutrients to refuel, nourish, and satisfy hunger without the sugar crash. For me, IQBAR is a great way to start the day when my appetite isn't quite going yet, but I know I need to put some protein in my system. With 9 delicious flavors that are always free from gluten, dairy, soy, GMOs, and artificial sweeteners, IQBAR is a great snack for any time. My personal faves are mint chocolate chip and toasted coconut chip. Plus, I really love IQBAR's hydration mixes. They're unsweetened and packed with flavor to deliver hydration without the gross aftertaste. And right now, IQBAR is offering our special podcast listeners 20% off all IQBAR products, plus get free shipping. To get your 20% off, text STRANGE to 64,000. Text STRANGE to 64,000. That's STRANGE to 64,000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details. The next night, Esther woke her sister again, this time loudly claiming that she was dying. Her sister apparently replied, quote, "Dying? Why, dying people don't speak in that loud tone. Wait until I light the lamp. Don't die in the dark, Esther," end quote. Okay. Now, either Esther was prone to exaggeration so much that her sister's response to her declaring she was dying was basically a verbal eye roll, or Jane was not the nicest of people. I suppose it's possible Jane just sort of didn't like Esther. Maybe she was just losing patience. I don't know. Whatever her feelings for her sister may have been, she was shocked to find, once she lit the lamp, Esther standing in the middle of the room, her face blood red, her eyes bugging out of their sockets, and her fingernails dug into the chair she was apparently gripping onto for dear life. The rest of the family rushed into the room, and Esther was escorted back to bed, while various family members called her crazy, again. And then, quote, "After sitting on the edge of the bed for a moment and gazing about the room with a vacant stare, she started to her feet with a wild yell and said she felt like bursting into pieces," end quote. Esther felt like her whole body was swelling to the point that it might burst. And Olive's husband quickly confirmed that her face and hands were swelling up and her skin was hot to the touch. Pretty soon, her whole body had swollen to, quote, "an enormous size," and she was screaming in pain and grinding her teeth. And then there was a loud boom, and the house seemed to shake as if it had been struck by lightning. But the skies were perfectly clear, not a rain cloud in sight. And no sooner had they learned that when another 3 enormous booms went off, this time seemingly from underneath Esther's bed. Must have been one big mouse, I guess. After the 3 booms, Esther had shrunk back down to her normal size and went directly to sleep. The next night at dinner, the family was like, "So, that was weird last night, huh? How about we definitely don't tell the neighbors about it?" But 4 nights later, Esther had another attack in bed, swelling up to an unnatural size. Jane's advice was to lie still and just try to ride it out. Esther laid still, probably in a lot of pain and fear, for about 5 minutes. Nothing like having your whole body swell up and your sister tells you to ignore it and go to sleep. Esther's bedding, though, had different plans. Apparently, all the bedclothes flew off the bed and landed in a heap in the corner of the room. Both girls screamed, Jane fainted, and once again the whole family came running in to see what all the fuss was. Olive tried covering her sister with the blankets that had removed themselves from her bed, but once again the blankets were like, nope, and flew themselves right back off into the corner. Esther laid back down, and her pillow wrested itself from under her head and flew across the room, hitting John in the face. At this point, John was like, fuck this shit, and he fled to the safety of his own, less haunted room. William went to get some water and a washcloth to help cool Esther down, and it took the remainder of the adults sitting on Esther's bed to keep everything from flying off again. Listen, I will admit that it's a little hard to keep track of the sequence of events and the whereabouts of the bedding. But Hubble was not the greatest writer, so according to his telling, one moment the bedding was on Jane, and the next moment it was back on Esther's bed. Try to keep up. William returned with the water, and there were 3 booms that came from somewhere near Esther's bed and were so loud that they shook the room. Esther had shrunk back down to her normal size again and was apparently now sleeping peacefully. The next day, they called on the doctor because, duh. At first, the doctor laughed in their faces, but then he agreed to come that evening to see for himself. He showed up around 10, examined Esther, and announced that she was suffering from a case of nerves from what must have been some kind of tremendous shock. Just as he said this, Esther's pillow seemed to straighten out on its own from under her head, quote, as if filled with air, and then righted itself. The doctor was like, WTF, did you see that? And John said, quote, if it moves out again, it will not go back, for I intend to hold on to it, even if it did bang me over the head last night, end quote. John had a score to settle with that pillow. He would show it who was boss. And the pillow, it seems, accepted his challenge. Hubble wrote, quote, John had no sooner spoken these words than out came the pillow from under Esther's head as before. He waited until it had just started back again, and then grasped it with both hands and held on with all his strength. The pillow, however, was pulled from him by some invisible power stronger than himself. As he felt it being pulled away, his hair actually stood on end. End quote. The doctor then exclaimed, how wonderful, which was probably not how the family would have described it. The loud booming or knocking started up again and seemed to follow the doctor around the room from under the floor. Also, Esther's bedding once again vacated itself from her bed. While everyone was following the sound of the loud knocking, or whatever it was, there was a scratching noise heard from back over at Esther's bed, and, as if by magic, the words, Esther Cox, you are mine to kill, appeared on her headboard. I don't know in what medium the letters were written, pen, pencil, crayon, charcoal, or just scratched in. Who knows? As everyone stood there trying to figure out WTF was going on, a piece of the ceiling fell on the doctor's head. As he picked it up and placed it on a chair, the loud knocking started up again, shaking the room, and carried on for the next 2 hours. The doctor promised to come back in the morning and give Esther something for her nerves. Obviously, he couldn't begin to explain the bedding flying around and the loud knocking, but he thought that somehow, if Esther got better, all this shit would stop. The doctor came back the next morning, and Esther seemed recovered. She went down into the basement for something and came running back up, claiming someone was down there and had thrown a plank of wood at her. The doctor went to check and found no one, so he brought Esther back down with him, and someone or something started throwing potatoes at them. The doctor said fuck this shit and left, but again promised to come back that evening with sedatives. That night, despite having given Esther some pretty serious sleep drugs, the shenanigans started back up again. This time, the knocking started under the bed again and made its way up to the roof. The doctor went out to investigate and claimed he saw nothing, but that the sounds could be heard 200 yards away. The neighbors were now beginning to talk. According to a piece by Nicole Baker for the National Library of Medicine, quote, neighbors, friends, and townspeople alike witnessed these strange happenings around Esther Cox, and they were widely reported in the local news. The Amherst Gazette published several accounts by locals, including that the loud sounds could be, quote, heard by people in the street as they passed the house, end quote. Apparently, also, the loud sounds were now happening day and night. 3 weeks later, still under the doctor's care, Esther went into a trance-like state, during which she finally revealed what happened on her carriage ride with Bob. She had never revealed why she came home so freaked out that evening. It's worth mentioning here that Bob apparently left town immediately after the carriage ride and never returned. Olive responded to Esther's revelation by basically being like, I told you that boy was no good. He's probably the cause of all this, to which the room received a reply of sorts with 3 more loud knocks. I mean, yes, Bob sucked for sure, but this is supposed to be a satisfactory explanation? So either Bob can conjure poltergeists or whatever, or Bob is hiding in the floor. Either way, this is a problem. So then Jane decided whatever it was could hear them. So they asked if whatever it was could hear them, and they received 3 knocks in reply. Then they asked how many people were in the room and received the correct number of knocks in response. Hubble, by way of dispelling any suspicion that it was Esther doing the knocking, explained that Esther couldn't have possibly known how many people were in the room because her face was buried in her pillows. I mean, unless that also rendered her deaf, I'm pretty sure she could have kept track of who was in there based on who was talking. Pretty soon, religious leaders were visiting the cottage to ascertain for themselves just what was going on there. Dr. Reverend Clay, a Baptist clergyman, came away so convinced that Esther wasn't tricking everyone in some way that he defended her on the pulpit. He believed whatever shock she'd received on her injurious carriage ride with Bob had basically turned her body into a human battery of sorts, and the knocks were the result of tiny bolts of lightning issuing forth from her body. How that explains the messages being written out on the walls, I don't know. A Reverend R.A. Temple also visited and witnessed a bucket of water apparently start boiling on its own. Once word from the church officials got out, people started lining up outside the cottage door to witness the whole thing for themselves. The goings-on only stopped when Esther was laid up for 2 weeks with diphtheria and then went to visit another sister for 2 weeks. Fortunately for Esther and her sister, the troubles did not seem to follow her. But everything started back up much worse once Esther returned home. Now she claimed she could hear the ghost, or whatever it was, talking to her. It told her it was going to burn the house down. And while Esther was the only one who could hear it speak, the others learned they could communicate with it through yes or no questions it could answer with knocks. 1 knock for no, 3 for yes, and 2 for I don't know. Dan asked the thing if it was indeed going to burn the house down, and it replied with 3 knocks. Everyone apparently thought this was absurd, as the house was powered by electricity until lit matches started falling from the ceiling. There were only 10 or so they were easily managed, but then the ghost, or whatever it was, grabbed a dress that was hanging on a hook, balled it up, threw it under the bed, and set it on fire. That fire was quickly extinguished, but the next would not be so easy to put out. Strangers, 3-Day Blinds is back. I love that it's staying lighter later these days, but when my kid needs to go to bed before the sun is down, he's not pleased. But with serious blackout shades, he doesn't have to be reminded that he's going to sleep while it's still light out. And for me, I need my room dark as a cave for my mid-afternoon naps. But Daisy, I hear you cry, I'm no draperist, that's not a word. I don't know the first thing about curtains and shades. That's what the experts at 3-Day Blinds are here for. They do all the heavy lifting. From design, measuring, and installing, you can sit back and relax and leave it to the pros. 3-Day Blinds has thousands of options that you can choose from to fit any budget or style. I checked them out on Instagram, and they have some really good-looking blinds. Plus, they've been in business for over 45 years and have helped over 2 million people get the window treatments of their dreams. So you know you can trust their work. Right now, get quality window treatments that fit your budget with 3-Day Blinds. Head to 3dayblinds.com/strange for their buy one, get one 50% off deal on custom blinds, shades, shutters, and drapery. For a free, no-charge, no-obligation consultation, just head to 3dayblinds.com/strange. One last time, that's buy one, get one 50% off when you head to the number 3dayblinds.com/strange. About 3 days later, while both Olive and Esther were on the first floor doing chores and the 2 little boys were playing out in the yard, the 2 women noticed smoke coming from the basement. They worked up their courage to go investigate, and Olive brought a bucket of water. In the basement, some wood shavings in a barrel had seemingly lit themselves on fire. Olive, having spilled half the water on the way down, poured the rest on the fire to no avail, and then cried, quote, "Oh, if Dan were at home, he could put it out," end quote. With what? His dick? They finally had the sense to run out into the street and yell fire, at which point a stranger, who no one had apparently ever seen before, came in and calmly put the fire out with his coat and a floor mat. Afterward, he allegedly walked off into the distance, never to be seen again. I guess we're supposed to assume that was Jesus or something? Would have been nice if he'd stayed, because shit was about to get worse. A few nights later, the family was gathered in the parlor when Esther suddenly stood up and pointed with a trembling hand and said, quote, look there, my God, it is the ghost. Don't you all see him? There he stands all in gray. See how his eyes are glaring at me, and he laughs when he says I must leave the house tonight, or he will start a fire in the loft under the roof and burn us all to death. Oh, what shall I do? Where shall I go? The ground is covered with snow. And yet I cannot remain here, for he will do what he threatens. He always does. Oh, I wish I were dead." End quote. Her brother-in-law Dan agreed, but wanted her to understand that it wasn't him kicking her out of his own volition, but that the ghosts left him no choice but to kick her out. So Esther was shuttled off to stay with friends, Mr. and Mrs. White, and their young son. She had a 3-week respite until something started harassing her with a scrub brush, hiding it from her and then dropping it on her head. Eventually, Esther and her hosts could hear phantom footsteps, and then the fires began again. Fearing his house would burn down, Mr. White took Esther with him to the saloon where he worked. But the change of locale once again did nothing to thwart whatever was tormenting poor Esther. You know what they say, no matter where you go, there you are. Someone apparently had a truly inspired idea of how to get the ghost to stop. Hubble wrote, quote, "Someone suggested that if she could stand on glass, they would cease. So pieces of glass were put into her shoes, but as their presence caused her head to ache and her nose to bleed without stopping the manifestations, the idea was abandoned." End quote. They made her stand on pieces of glass. Heavy doors flew off their hinges, and a ghost took the young son's small knife out of his pocket twice and stabbed Esther in the back with it. "Yeah, Dad, I swear it was the ghost." Heavy things moved around of their own accord until someone had yet another brilliant idea. This time, they would weigh Esther down to her chair with iron spikes. I assume the spikes were faced upwards. Hubble wrote, quote, "To the astonishment of everybody, the spikes were not removed by the ghost, but instead became too hot to be handled with comfort, and a second afterwards were thrown by the ghost to the far end of the saloon, a distance of 20 feet. End quote. Esther and her phantasmagoric guest were given the boot by the Whites and went to stay with another couple who then brought in a group of men whom Hubble described as, quote, "men whose minds have a scientific turn." End quote. I mean, the same could be said for RFK Jr. That doesn't mean he actually knows anything of value. It was at this new home, with the aid of these scientifically minded gentlemen, that Esther's visitors were finally identified. And yes, there were more than one. There was Peter Cox, who claimed to be a relative of Esther's, and who said he did everything he could to rein in the other two, who went by the names of Maggie Fisher and Bob Nickel. Bob Nickel, incidentally, identified himself as having been a shoemaker, which just happened to be what Bob McGuire's trade was. Esther moved 2 more times over the next few weeks, finally spending 8 weeks with a couple who lived about 3 miles from the village of Amherst, during which time she received a break from the ghostly torment because, as Hubble explained, quote, "the ghosts allowed her to enjoy the calm repose of a life in the woods, the Van Amberg farm being literally situated in the woods." End quote. Consider it ghosts, I guess. After 8 weeks in the woods, for some fakakta reason, Esther decided to move back into the godforsaken cottage where this whole nightmare began. Look, I don't mean to victim blame here, but why are you going back there? And this is where our Mr. Walter Hubble enters the picture. Hubble, having heard about Esther from local news accounts, and having just finished a run with his dramatic company in Newfoundland, decided to pop over to Amherst to pay the family a visit and somehow convince them to let him live with them? I believe by this point the two Johns had moved out, but still, this guy was a complete stranger and this was a really small house. Whose room do you suppose he shared? Esther and Jane's? The little boys? I don't know. I don't think I like this at all. He then refers to himself in third person for the remainder of the story. Long story short, LOL too late, the ghosts were not fans of Hubble and basically threw whatever they could get their see-through hands on. Potter plants, shoes, paperweights, inkwells. But they would take breaks from throwing things at him to tell him, using their system of knocks, how much change he had in his pockets, or beating out the tempo of Yankee Doodle Dandy. Quote, the ghosts also undressed little George, and as if to make a final climax to the day's performance, Bob, the head ghost, started a small bonfire upstairs, and he and the other ghosts piled all the chairs in the parlor one on top of the other until they made a pile about 6 feet in height, when, as if in sport, they pulled out those underneath, letting all the others fall to the floor with a crash. End quote. Okay, first of all, you're going to gloss over the possible sexual assault of a child? I don't want salacious details, but this actually seems like a crime, or at the very least, a prelude to a crime. Listen, if some strange man I didn't know moved himself into my house and then my young son is being undressed by some unseen hand, that man will be invited to leave with my boot up his ass. But also, how did he know which ghost was leading the charge? Could he see them? Were they stopping to communicate with their knocks while setting up this indoor bonfire? And not for nothing, but this was a small cottage. It seems to me that a fire with that much furniture as fuel would have burned the place down pretty quick. No? Hubble is then introduced to 3 more ghosts, Mary Fisher, who says she is Maggie's sister, Jane Nickel, and Eliza McNeil. I'd like to point out to the listener here that of the 6 ghosts apparently tormenting Esther and the occupants of the cottage, one was named Bob, and another had the last name of McNeil, which happened to both be the first and last name of the man who attacked Esther in the carriage that awful night. Strangers, last night I made roasted garlic mashed potatoes, and you know I used Graza's Sizzle olive oil to roast the garlic. It was absolutely delicious. Next time we have guests, I'm putting out fresh bread with fresh roasted garlic and Graza's Drizzle olive oil, which is perfect for finishing, dipping, and making delicious, fresh salad dressings. Plus, Graza has a new Frizzle olive oil with a higher 490-degree smoke point, which is perfect for frying, crisping, or grilling. Graza's olive oils use only one olive from one region with no mysterious blends. That means a traceable, fresher product without mixing in any lower grade or unknown oils. And listen, you might think I'm crazy, but try drizzling some of their Drizzle olive oil over ice cream. I promise you, it's an incredible treat. So head to graza.co and use Strange to get 10% off of Trio, which includes Sizzle, Frizzle, and Drizzle, and get to cooking your next chef-quality meal. Hubble stayed with the family for 6 weeks, during which time he conversed with the ghosts, even though they continued to throw things at him in a most unwelcoming manner. Esther also began talking to ghosts. Hubble wrote, quote, during his stay in the house, Esther often went into a state very similar to the mesmeric sleep, during which she talked with people invisible to all present, among others her dead mother. On coming out of this strange state, she always said she had been to heaven among the angels. End quote. Esther had several more nocturnal attacks in which her body swelled to an enormous size, and she was moved around the bed, quote, as if Beelzebub himself were in her. End quote. Things got really bad in the little cottage. Hubble tells us that during his stay, quote, fires were continually being started, the walls were being broken by chairs, the bedclothes pulled off in the daytime, heavy sofas turned upside down, knives and forks thrown with such force that they would stick into doors, food disappeared from the table, finger marks became visible in the butter, And worse than all, strange voices could be heard calling the inmates by name in the broad light of day." End quote. Finally, the decision was made that Esther had to GTFO for good. She went back to live with the couple in the woods where apparently ghosts don't like to be or something. And that is when the whole affair stopped. Just like that. Esther left and never came back, and neither she nor her family in the little cottage in Amherst were ever molested by ghostly apparitions ever again. And if you have trouble believing this story, Hubble assures you it's true. He concluded his account with this, quote, "Reader, a word. This account of the haunted house in which Esther Cox suffered so much, and the author had such a remarkable experience, is no fanciful creation of the imagination, but really what it is claimed to be, a true ghost story." End quote. Well, there you have it. The guy says it's true, so obviously it's true. But in the inimitable words of every man ever, well, actually. In a piece for the Proceedings of the American Society for Psychical Research from 1919, titled "A Critical Study of the Great Amherst Mystery" by parapsychologist and founder of the Boston Society for Psychical Research, Walter F. Prince, Ph.D., Prince discounts Hubble's tale piece by piece. Remember that Hubble is pretty much the only source we have for this story. Even researcher Nicole Baker's claim that the Amherst Gazette published several accounts by locals, including that the loud sounds could be heard by people in the street as they passed the house, is dubious. Of these original newspaper accounts, Prince had this to say, quote, "One is forced to conclude that our actor friend does not consider accuracy of prime importance by observing that none of the newspaper items in the appendix is printed as in the respective newspapers. The changes are not important, being such in the first quoted item as changing the word raps to knocks, expunging 3 before different days, altering sealing to air, etc. But the point is that the investigator feels at liberty to alter facts when he thinks this can do no harm. The thought comes forth from the atmosphere. What if he should carry this license into his report of the Amherst phenomena?" End quote. In other words, if Hubble was willing to change words from the original articles, what other pieces of information might he have felt comfortable changing? Hubble claims he's uniquely qualified to investigate this case because he's an actor who's well-versed in stagecraft and magic tricks. But, as Prince points out, spotting tricks during a staged play or magic show is a lot different than being at the mercy of a person who can pull off tricks whenever she feels like it, catching the trickee off guard. Events that take place in darkened rooms can pretty much be discounted outright, and pretty much everything that Hubble claimed he saw during the day in well-lit spaces could be explained away with strings and sleights of hand. Hubble eventually printed 10 editions of his Great Amherst Mystery, with each edition containing more detail than the one before it. But, as Prince points out, the main eyewitnesses to the events, Olive and Dan, both claim that Hubble greatly dramatized and embellished in places. Furthermore, the men of science Hubble names in his book could not be verified, and Prince points out there is no way of knowing really anything at all about them beyond Hubble's opinions. When pressed for verification from so-called eyewitnesses, Hubble just wrote up a letter for these eyewitnesses to sign that said that what he wrote in his book was true. But that's not really worth the paper it's printed on. It's just about as useful as his statement that he was telling the truth. Like, okay, says you, and these random people. All of the dialogue in Hubble's book was manufactured by Hubble, especially the conversations he wasn't present for. Everything in Hubble's book was manufactured by Hubble. There was absolutely no way of knowing if one single word of it was true. Of Prince's review of Hubble's investigation, I think this is the most withering passage. Quote, "It has sometimes been said, and I think justly, that an investigator in this field ought to have the gift of humor to save him from illogical absurdities in either direction. While Mr. Hubble is often unintentionally funny, so that poor Andrew Lang, another investigator, had to confess, I have rarely laughed more than over the great Amherst mystery. It seems quite certain that he has, personally, little faculty of humor." End quote. Ouch. Dr. Prince himself does seem to take at least one liberty with the story, which is to assume that Bob McNeil raped Esther during that carriage ride, or, at the very least, explicitly threatened to. Dr. Prince cites this passage from Hubbell's journal, from which he wrote the book. Quote, "Daniel Teed explained the true nature of the torture to me," says the actor-investigator, "but it must be nameless here." End quote. Prince surmises, quote, "It is plain from the journal that the torture consisted in Bob Nickel being supposed to act the part of the incubus, an obvious objectification of McNeil's vile purpose on the night of August 28th, with the accompaniment of anguish due to the original emotional reaction of horror on the part of the young woman." End quote. In other words, Esther was so traumatized by the rape or attempted rape that her PTSD manifested as ghosts who constantly molested her and anyone near her. I am willing to get on this particular train of thought. She was incredibly distressed by whatever took place that night on the carriage ride, and when she tried to express herself, she was chided and warned she'd be put in an insane asylum. That kind of shit, it seems to me, might make someone start acting out and causing mayhem. Wouldn't be the first time. Listen, Dr. Prince's takedown of Hubbell is not without its own glaring problems. At one point, he seems to blame things on Esther's period, saying that, as we all know, women be crazy when they're bleeding. He also posits that she developed multiple personalities brought on by the amount of sedatives administered to her by the doctor. I'm no psychologist, but I'm pretty sure having multiple personalities doesn't make furniture fly around the room on its own. Then again, what do I know? Or me. Or me. The town of Amherst now has a thing called Estherfest, because, of course they do. It appears to be a whopping 2 weeks long and culminates in a big block party with bouncy houses and everything. I don't know. If I were Esther, this might make me really angry. Let's hope, maybe in the afterlife, Esther has found some peace and worked through her trauma, because if not, if I were a resident of Amherst, I might think twice before attending any one of the many, many spooky events at Estherfest. You might just find one of those chintzy paranormal-themed tchotchkes hurtling toward your head, or that haunted house suddenly bursting into flames around you. Next time on Strange and Unexplained. For a couple of centuries, a small green book was passed around as an item of curiosity. It was filled with symbols and letters that no one seemed to be able to translate. Finally, in 2011, a small team decoded the book and discovered codes within codes, possible secret societies within secret societies, and questions within questions. The Copialis Cipher. Strange and Unexplained is a production of Three Goose Entertainment with help from Grab Bag Collab. This episode was written by me, Daisy Egan, with research by Joe Gurdett, sound design and engineering by Jeff Devine, music by Epidemic and Blue Dot Sessions. Strange and Unexplained is a production of Three Goose Entertainment with help from Grab Bag Collab. This episode was written by Eve Kerrigan and me, Daisy Egan, with research by the Strange Research Squad, sound engineering by Jeff Devine. If you have an idea for an episode, head to our website, strangeandunexplainedpod.com, and fill out the contact form. I will write back. For more amazing content, join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab, where for just $5 a month you get all the Grab Bag exclusive shows, and for $8 you get those, plus Amber Hunt's Crimes of the Centuries and Strange and Unexplained early and ad-free. Grab Bag is an all-female and non-binary owned profit share network where our contributors get to keep ownership of their shows. We strive to give a platform to those who might not be able to land themselves on a bigger network. Who knows? Maybe you have a podcast idea you'd like to pitch to Grab Bag. We've got live recordings, watch parties, book clubs, and more. Why there's so much going on over at GrabBag, you'll wonder if we missed the memo on how capitalism works. Join me on Instagram at SNUPod, Daisy Egan, and GrabBag Collab, or head to the Facebook page to join in the conversation. If you like the show, please visit a sponsor with our unique code, give us a quick review and 5 stars, subscribe and download, and tell a friend. Stay strange.